Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this. Yes, I'm great. Thanks, Dave.
He's still got that stinker of a cold.
I have got the stinking
He's just
cold.
manning up about it. That's what he is, manning up.
Bad case of man flu.
And today we've got a fantastic treat for you. We've got James Cantrill. Hi, James. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I've never been described as a treat before. We'll
treat.
go with that.
You're the chocolate on the box. There we go. James, I think, is going to be fascinating to watch and listen to today because he's got a very diverse portfolio in terms of what he does, what he's done, and what he's interested in. I could tell you, but I'd rather him tell you because we've just had what's normally a 60-second pre-start chat, about 10 minutes, and Paul and I are just going, oh, say that, say that. So we've stopped it, and we're just going to say, Paul, let's listen to James and see what happens here. James, give us a potted sort of 2 to 3 minute overview of what it is you do, how you do it.
Right. Well, I'll start with the history. Grew up on a dairy farm just outside Stafford.
Yeah.
So some of my earlier things are, can you walk? Right. Next thing, can you drive a tractor? Can you milk a cow? All that kind of thing. So very involved in the family business. For one reason or another, personal family issues, we ended up selling the farming herd and looking to diversify the business. And also when I got older, Dad was always insistent, you're going off to university, you're going to get yourself another string. I'm very grateful for that. Then because, like with all farming families, there was a few family members around taking wages and salaries from the business. Dad was, right, you're going out to get yourself a job, lad, and you'll also be milking at the weekends. So I ended up going off to work for a couple of MEPs, members of the European Parliament, and in the days when we still did that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was very involved with farming policy there because, to a certain extent, I suppose I had a USP that I was a farmer's lad coming into the European Parliament. Now, although I was based in the UK, I got to go over there and do various bits and bobs. So I very quickly was being asked my opinion and doing things like that. One of my regrets, I suppose, is I was asked to go and be an advisor to the Conservative delegation in Brussels, but I wasn't unfortunately able to take that up. But I got to be quite involved, and I think I was saying to you before, I remember once we were at the Strasbourg Parliament and the French farmers turned up to protest. And
they know how to protest.
Yeah, and I got told off for standing against the big glass windows watching it because I was just fascinated watching these burning bales of straw flying over the fence and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
And on one hand, they said it was dangerous, and on the other hand, I kind of was thinking, I wish we did these kind of things. Maybe someone would take a bit more notice of the farming industry. But anyway, so I did that, and then I toddled off to be head of news and current affairs at a radio station for a few years, and then found myself coming up to 2010 getting pulled back into politics, and and also my responsibilities on the family business due to my father's health became a bit more pressing, and that's always been top priority for me. So that pulled me back to doing that. So that's worked out very well for me because I've been able to do the politics, be involved, and run the family business at the same time. So
wow,
it worked quite well for me.
And you say your farm diversified a bit. How did the farm evolve?
So we basically took a look at obviously we got rid of the milking herd for various reasons to do with my father's health, and again keen. I was young at the time, but keen farmer's lad. I was like, don't worry, Dad, I'll do the 2-3 hours milking, and I'll come and work on the farm. And Dad, bless him, no longer with us, but he was very clear on, no, you're not. This is my decision, and you're gonna go and have another string to your bow. So so what we looked at is we took a real look at where we were, what our location was, and what things we had going for us. And one of the good things in Staffordshire is they've got a very good system of county farms. So starter farms, intermediate, move on to that, and really encouraging folks to get into farming, and that's something I always think is a great system to encourage new people into the industry. But as we all know, with farming at the moment, the amount of land you've got is always a challenge. You have to be a little bit bigger to make that profit margin acceptable.
Yeah.
So we found that quite a few of the farmers around us were really struggling with the amount of acreage they've got. So we have turned quite a bit of our farm over to grazing agreements. So we still do the farming, we're still growing the grass, we're doing all the maintenance and that kind of thing, but they then pay us for the crop. So it's allowed them to either turn more of their unit over to grazing and then use ours for the silage or whatever. We come to a negotiation, or obviously with a grazing agreement, clues in the name. Sometimes they come and just take the crop off by sticking 40 animals on it or whatever. So that's one of the things that we've done on the business, and that's worked very well for us and very well for them as well. Also my personal thing that I was interested in, myself and my wife, is rare breed animals, and we went into rare breed pigs. Partly also helping with the development of rare breeds, so Tamworths, Saddlebacks. Got a couple of coonies because my wife wanted them, even though they drive me mad. And but the really being involved in mixing up the breeds again, because obviously the bloodlines were all getting a little bit thin. Just like they do with one or two farming communities and all, which is my I keep being attacked for marrying a girl from Hampshire, but I often say, well, I've done my bit for done my bit to stir it up. I'm going to get myself in dreadful trouble for that, but I have.
You are. You're going to be doing. Yeah. You're going to be doing odd jobs till the week past your death.
I've made that joke. Yeah, I've made that joke at a couple of family events, so that gets me in trouble there and all. But no, in terms of just mixing up the bloodlines, so just being clear that you're not just breeding the same bloodlines again, mixing them up to try and make sure that you can keep the breed going and keeping it healthy, and then obviously making that pay by selling some of the meat from the farm gate. Now there are challenges with that, because we've gone very much with a completely non-chemical approach to that. Obviously in some parts of the pig industry, there's a lot of chemical in the feed, which gets them to grow a bit quicker. We've decided to go with a slower growth, but keeping it natural. And I'm not disagreeing with people who go down that line. We just decided to go down a different line. But it does mean that there's a cost. So you got the cost of the meat, even if you're just breaking even. And with the cost of living crisis, some people have found that's too much for them. So that's been a bit of a challenge. And also with COVID, selling from the farm gate wasn't possible, wasn't allowed. So we had to just curb back on that. So things in that regard have taken a bit of a break for the time being. But we are building that up again now and looking into that. And also we had an opportunity because of the location we're at, which is right next to the town of Stafford. It wasn't when my family bought it over 100 years ago, but it is now. So we've sold off some land for development as well, because it's a very good opportunity. Those kind of are different ways that we've mixed things up, and we do some caravan storage. And I think I said before, I feel a bit like the Del Boy of farming, because it's like, well, we do a bit of this and we do a bit of that, but we just decided, we'd split things up and do a lot of different types of things on the farm. So we're not diverse. We're just not reliant on one thing anymore.
And have you kept your interest in policy making and things like that as well? Are you still working with the government at all in trying to shape policy from a farmer's perspective?
Yeah. So I certainly won't claim to be at the centre of anything. I'm in. This will sound like a dreadful name dropper. I'm not going to drop any names at all, and I'm not going to say I'm best friends with anybody like some people do. You sometimes go to some of these things, and someone will say, "Oh, I'm best friends with the Prime Minister." It's like, what you mean? You met him once, but the because I've been involved in politics for a long time, there are some people who are now elected politicians and in reasonably senior roles that I grew up with. So we know them, and I know occasions when they were an idiot. So it's always quite useful to remember those. But anyway, I have the opportunity at occasions to drop things in, but I'm very much about folks down on the ground, because my personal view is that politicians far too often listen to the civil servants, and having on occasion seen civil servants at work, I would start saying that Yes Minister, if folks remember that, is a documentary rather than a comedy. But
you're not the first person to say that.
No, so they can be incredibly persuasive, and they can be incredibly dominant, and have on occasions been involved in meetings where, on behalf of the MPs that I work for, where the minister is sat there and the civil servant keeps interrupting the minister to almost say, well, you can't say that and you can't say that. And I often find that a little bit frustrating, because you want to say, however, meanwhile, on the ground, the people actually doing the work. So I've really been keen on listening to farmers, hearing what they've got to say, because I also think, just as an aside, I think there's still a bit of a regard that your average farmer is leaning on his farm gate, chewing a piece of straw, saying everything's got to be exactly the same. But actually, I think if you get out there now and talk to farmers, not just younger farmers, farmers of all ages, they have realised that the world has changed, and farming has got to change in different ways, and they're really keen to do it. And I think if the government and the policymakers would just engage more with farmers, we could get ourselves forward a lot quicker than we are at the moment. And I think there's just a real desire to get those views heard, and that's what I've really pushed for in the jobs I've done, really.
I mean, there are so many massive changes that are affecting farming at the moment. I mean, we're three and a bit years past the COVID and lockdown experience, where there's a massive shift in culture in society, people's perception of agriculture and farming and farmers, and then environmental issues and concerns, the weather. I mean, at the moment, it's causing havoc for farms. What are some of the big changes taking place in farms right now, and how do you think farmers need to adapt for the future?
Well, I guess the caveat I have to put at the start of that is how I think farms should be changing for the future is not the same as the government thinks farms should be changing for the future. And
other opinions are available, is what I'm
okay. Yeah, so I'll say other opinions are available, and I'll give you my view. I think we just have to turn on the news every night. And we've had Brexit, obviously we've had COVID, but I think if we see the situation in Ukraine, the fact that Russia could just turn round overnight and say, well, that's all perfectly fine, but we're now going to block the Black Sea so no one can have the grain, and the impact that caused to the money markets and the international market overnight. I'm very surprised that governments aren't more saying, oh, well, this is a massive red light flashing, saying that actually this whole distribution system around the world could be turned off in a moment. You've got China rattling the cage over Taiwan. You've got the situation in the Middle East as we speak, which is red hot. I think that the British farming industry ought to be sitting down with the government and saying, right, how are we going to make ourselves self-sufficient? How are we going to ensure that we, as much as possible, insulate ourselves from what's going on? Because at the moment, as far as I can see, if you'll excuse the expression, the next problem happens in the world, Britain's going to find itself with its backside hanging out. Just ready for some other country to hit it or slap it. So I think that I completely understand why we need to be looking after the environment. I completely understand that there is a real desire that we start trying to mitigate the effects of climate change and things like that. I'm not going to disagree with anybody about that, but I actually think that the main focus has to be making us self-sufficient as a nation in terms of our primarily food production, making sure that everybody's fed. And I also think that once you've done that, there's also a part to be played by the farming industry in terms of generation of electric and those kind of things as well. But I would always say that is not the first priority.
I was going to ask you whether you thought, James, that the two things can go hand in hand. So, food security, which is the big phrase that everyone talks about, can that go hand in hand with a progressive view of the environment? Did you think the two things can go hand in hand, or have we got to focus on one more than the other?
No, I think they can go hand in hand. I think the problem that we've got is we've gone too far the other way.
Right.
And I think we're talking about taking a lot of land out of production.
Yes.
And I don't think that is the way to go. I think and now you may turn around and say to me, well, James, you're a massive hypocrite because you've just said that you've sold some land for development. Well, that was the way I don't worry, the irony has not escaped me. But that was the right thing for our that was the right thing for our business.
But just interrupting you, James, but if in that scenario there would have been a scheme in place that would have made it more beneficial to you to hold on to that land, if that scheme could be created, and that's not beyond the realms of man that we can't do that. Yes, we need housing, of course we do. That's a separate issue. But from a farmer's perspective, whether it's putting solar panels on my land or not building properties but keeping it as food production, as long as that is financially viable, I think most of the farming community would prefer probably to keep it for food production than sell it for housing. So it's all to do with just the will, isn't it, really, of the governments and the schemes to make that attractive. In your case, it's just that was the best option. But if a better option would have been to keep it, I'm sure you and the family may well have done so.
Absolutely. I will be perfectly honest. Obviously, I realise this isn't a counselling session. There's no couch here, but but I do sometimes still sit there and wish that I'd insisted on carrying on milking the cows and we'd carried on running the farm as a farm. And there's part of me, I think, will always have that deep regret till the day I die. But the decision we took was the right decision for the business at the time.
Yeah.
Given the finances available. Now, in terms of the offer for farmers, I do think that a lot of things would be very different if farmers could see a way where they're going to make a decent amount of money. And I also kick back quite strongly at this insinuation from some people in government that they're having to make farmers look after the environment.
I think the whole people listening to this should be waving their papers.
I take that very personally on behalf of farmers everywhere, because I know how hard my grandfather and my father took looking after their land seriously, and talking about handing on good land, good fertile looked after land. I remember conversations about making sure you didn't take too much out of the soil. You had to make sure that plenty went back into the soil, and that wasn't an alien concept. So this whole talk about Britain's farmers creating some kind of wasteland, that if they allow farmers to carry on the way they have been, most of Wiltshire will look like the Sahara Desert by Thursday. I think it's just absolute nonsense. So I agree with your statement, really. The two can go hand in hand, but you just have to work with farmers. And I think this is the problem with folks who have never put on a pair of wellies. Making farming policy. And
there was something on the news just last night, I think it was, and there was a farmer who was to his own financial detriment, not harvesting a crop in a field because the ground was too wet. And he said, if I send my tractor on there, it'll do 5 years worth of damage to the soil.
Yeah, well, you get this.
So
Yeah.
I've got to forgo this year because of it.
Yeah. Now there are some regulations and things over what you do to the soil and things like that, and there are things that you have to comply with in terms of the good old-fashioned cross compliance in those days and all those kind of things. But that is the attitude of your vast majority of farmers, is thinking long term, thinking what's this going to do? What impact is this going to have? You hear the first thing about farmers rip out hedges. Tell you what, I know a lot more farmers whose life would be much easier if they pulled out all of the hedges on their farm and just had a combine covering about 80 acres, but they choose not to.
Yeah,
because of the nature and what lives in those hedges and benefits from them. So I really think there's stuff that can go hand in hand. But again, this is the problem with folks who dare I say, they know what the statistics say, and they know what things say in the reports, and they can repeat that till, if you'll excuse the phrase, the cows come home. But they don't actually know what it's like on a farm, and they don't actually know what's going on. Can I
interrupt you there, James, and say, so for the people listening, and we understand and respect your perspective is, you're not in government, you're outside of it, but there's the NFU, there's things like that. We're not suggesting, I don't think, that farmers get bales of hay and start setting fire to them like they were in France. But so what would be your suggestion to what farmers could do? Who can they speak to get their voice heard more? If that's the challenge, we need to get the farmers' voice heard more in either local government or central government. Have you got any thoughts on what they could do? Where do they need to go to get their voice heard?
Well, from my perspective, there is a general election within the next 12 months.
Okay.
And the NFU, I know certainly in my area, do a brilliant job of talking with local MPs and inviting them for meetings. But I would say get in touch with your local member of parliament. Right. And if you know who the candidates are who are standing for the parties, get in touch with them as well, and invite them to your farm.
Yeah, great.
Get them to actually come and take a look, and show them what the situation is, and explain what farmers actually are already doing. Because I think you also find with some of the candidates coming in, they haven't got a clue what's going on. And to a certain extent, if they don't come from that sector, why would they?
Exactly.
So, so at the moment, it's a great opportunity to do a bit of education.
I think that's a really good point, because we can often see very occasionally in Parliament, an MP will stand up and talk about something from an agricultural perspective, and it's very rare. But at the same time, we can't sit on our hands, can we, as farmers, and expect people who are from a non-farming background to understand farming. So I think that's a great suggestion of proactively contacting your local MPs, invite them to your farm, get them to come and have a look and talk to them over a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Then if lots of us do that, we've got a chance of more of the MPs, both locally and nationally, having an understanding of what really is happening. And it's not a bunch of people chucking loads of carbon into the atmosphere. We're doing fantastic work. So that's a great suggestion, James, I think. Speak to you. Good one.
And that's important, because it starts at a micro level, doesn't it? It has to be about what can the farmer themselves be doing, rather than just waiting for big organizational change that happen at the highest level. So James, you please feel free to say you'd rather not answer this, but no, I love that face. I love that face. That OMG, where are we going with this? Don't worry. It's a nice one. It's a nice one. But at the beginning, you were saying how massively diverse your farm both wanted to or had to become. That change, that terrifies a lot of people. Change terrifies most people. Farmers especially, because frequently they're second, third, fourth, even fifth generation. And How did you and the family cope with that change?
Gosh, that's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Well, my dad was a traditional farmer, so you'll be unsurprised to know my dad never said a word. He just carried on with it. I found it incredibly difficult, and because I'd grown up with it, and in my head was always, I'm going to take this farm on, and I'm going to be milking 200, 300 cows when I'm older, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And actually, I can still stand in the farmyard and I can tell you exactly what my plan was. I was going to put a barn over here and do this and do that. And so sometimes, I still struggle with it. But, it's the reality of life that sometimes things change. And you know what? You just get on with it. And
let me push there, if I may. And again, feel free to push back and say I'd rather not talk about it. But so there are people listening to this and watching this who will say, okay, I realize I have to diversify. I have to innovate. I have to change. I'm terrified. Yes, I've got to get on with it. But there is that paralysis of fear where, we procrastinate on making a decision and taking action upon it. And then we procrastinate for so long, it almost becomes suffocating and paralyzing. So you say you just have to get on with it. What made you get on with it? What advice would you give to someone who right now is procrastinating and a bit paralyzed with fear?
I think you have to. I fully understand what that was. And actually, the day we sold our herd, we had an auction on the farm, and it will still be one of the worst days of my life, I think. And I was only young, and I can still tell you exactly where things were and exactly what went on. But so I'm just being honest. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if you're from a farming family, been there for years. It's not an easy thing to do. But given the finances of farming, the one thing I would say is quite a few years later, our farm is still there. In a different form, but the farm is still there, and it's still functioning as a family business. And when my dad passed away last year, he was still able to feel that he'd handed on the business to the next generation. And I think, although he never really said anything, because my dad was one of those where you could take two pictures exactly the same of him just with a straight face, and it'd be like Dad on the worst day of his life, Dad on the best day of his life, and it'd still be. But he was still able to hand the farm onto the next generation. And you know what? We got to a situation, if I'm perfectly honest, where if we hadn't made that decision, I couldn't guarantee you he'd have been able to do that, either through his health or through, the way he was, he was flogging himself to death for not much money.
Can I just add an observation here of the industry that I work in now with farmers? I think your question, Dave, was a good one about where's the paralysis of fear. Do you think, James, that sometimes, how do I articulate this? There's almost a fear of judgment from other farmers for you quitting, you giving up almost, as opposed to sticking it out. There's almost not quite a macho thing, but there's you're going to be judged. You failed. You've not been able to make it work. Is that also a factor, do you think, that sometimes makes people go on for too long before making that important decision that your family made?
Yes. And you know what? There are, and I'll let you into a few conversations. There are folks in our community who will still regard me as James, the letdown, or something like that, because James hasn't carried on the business like he did. And it was interesting when the planning application went in for the land that we were selling, one guy ripped a strip off me about how dare you sell family land, you shouldn't do that, blah, blah, blah. And I later found out that he'd said to somebody else that I was an absolute disgrace. And then at the end of the conversation said, of course, if it was my land, I'd have done exactly the same thing. So you think, so you think,
And that's the reason I raised it, because I felt
Yeah.
that in the industry there is a bit of a looking down on people that quit. If you look outside of farming, and this is almost the last thing for me to say, really, if you look at Woolworths, if you look at Wilkinson's that's just gone, the businesses that don't change, that don't adapt to the altering environment, don't survive. The businesses, John Lewis is a good example of a business that's having to change the way it's operated and is surviving as a result of doing so. And I think farming, and I think some of that pressure to not change, not go out of farming, is what stops farming businesses from making that diversification leap. And it requires bravery, and maybe it's finding some supportive people around you can talk to about it.
Well, that's it, and it's kind of, and I'll be perfectly honest. We if you'll excuse the analogy, we kind of jumped out the plane before we worked out where the parachute was. Because our situation was a bit critical with my father's health and everything, and it was kind of, if you carry on milking 200, 300 cows a day and you're not going to let your son help, you're probably going to be dead within 12 months or whatever. And there were other issues, but it was horrible. And I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it's going to be absolutely fine, and you'll be great, and you'll be sat there sipping a pina colada, watching them sell all the cows and everything. But it's almost for the greater good. You have to sometimes sit there and say, do I actually want to carry on farming in some way on this farm, or am I going to risk that in 3 or 4 years the bank's going to come along and tell me the for sale signs are going up?
You can't argue with what's true, can you? Yeah.
Exactly. The world is changing. I think my grandfather died in the early 80s. And I sometimes, when you're having just a quiet moment, I think if he came back and came onto the farm now, what would he think? And I think he would look at the world and he would just think, what on earth is going on? Everything's changed. You've got these mobile phones, and who decided to make a tractor the size of a 3-bedroom house? Those kind of things. He would almost, if we'd have been doing exactly the same thing, I think he'd have been stood there going, what on earth are you doing? Why are you keeping everything the same as it was when I was here? So, if we look back in terms of our family and what our family did and how the farm was, it was unrecognizable almost every 2 decades, because things kept changing. And I sometimes think we're in danger that we try and store our businesses in aspic and say, I want to save the family business, so it's going to be exactly the same, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. If only fools and horses, that the old thing about Trigger's broom, where he says, I've had the same broom for 30 years. It's had 15 heads and 14 handles. And I think sometimes with farms, we can say that this farm has been exactly the same for 100 years. Well, actually, if you look into the history, it's been completely different and run in completely different ways. And I think sometimes you have to sit down and say, the world has changed and we haven't. If we don't change, we're not going to be here anymore, because the world ain't going to stop for you. And we found with our business that the world wasn't going to stop for us. And fortunately, I wouldn't recommend this, but after we'd sold the cows, we sat down and thought, well, what we're going to do now? And we were able to find those opportunities we talked about at the start.
Right.
Well, I think that is a very powerful message to conclude on. I think, so sit still in the motorway, you're going to get run over. So have those conversations, start having a plan, look at James's story there, the wonderful story of diversification, innovation and change, some of it obligated, some of it by choice and necessity. But James, honestly, that was very open of you, very honest, at times quite touching, actually. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you a bit more. And I actually found it really fascinating. What do you reckon, Paul?
Absolutely. And I think, again, what we're trying to do in these conversations is get it really applicable to farmers. And I think they'll hear you and wave their ballot papers on. We need to have the local voice. Great piece of advice, I think, to get you to speak to your local MP, particularly as they've got to win votes at the next general election. That was brilliant advice. And the second one was embrace change, whether it's painful or pleasurable. It's inevitable. So you've got to just embrace it. I think those are two fantastic messages at least the team can take away.
No, that's great. Well, thank you guys. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for your time and your generosity. Thank you. So that was interesting. A great conversation with James Cantrill about diversifying a farm and the challenges of modern farming. Now we're going to go into that in a bit deeper depth with a one-to-one interview with Bill Young. Check out his CV and resume, and he's only telling us a fraction of it. Enjoy.